Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today as we launch our first conversation in a series of talks and panel discussions coinciding with Gajah Gallery's ongoing show, I Gusti Ayu Kadek Murniasi, Shards of My Dreams That Remain in My Consciousness, where we explore different aspects of Murni's work and legacy. So my name is Nicole of Gajah Gallery, and today we will be talking to art historian Dr. Astri Wright, who will discuss some of the themes she explored in her recent essay, Intersecting Worlds, Making Invisible Dimensions Visible, Further Explorations in Murni's Art. So I'd just like to remind everyone that at the end of this conversation, we will be answering some questions from the audience. So feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A box throughout the talk, and we will respond to them later. But before we begin the conversation, I just want to give a brief background on the gallery for those joining us today. So since 1996, it's actually our 25th anniversary this year, Gajah Gallery has been a pioneering body in the Southeast Asian art scene, representing a portfolio of the region's leading artists, as well as engaging with some of its brightest emerging talents. In 2012, we opened the Jogja Art Lab in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, as an experimental platform for artists to come together and produce works across various mediums. So Yao has worked with artists across Southeast Asia like Ashley Bickerton, Unizar, and Suzanne Victor. Like I mentioned earlier, currently on view at our Singapore space is the solo show of the late Balinese artist I Gusti Ayu Kadek Murniasi, Shards of My Dreams That Remain in My Consciousness, which is why we're together today. And the show brings together a diverse collection of paintings and sculptures that span the artist's prolific decade-long career from the mid-1990s to 2006. And now I'm so honored to introduce to you our speaker for today, Dr. Astri Wright. She is a researcher of modern and contemporary Indonesian art, an independent curator, and a professor of Southeast Asian art history in the Department of Art History and Visual Studies at the University of Victoria in Canada. Her main research has been divided between focusing on the first generation of nationalist Indonesian artists, pre-revolution and Sukarno era, activist artists, and women artists during the Suharto era, and since the turn of the 21st century on global collaborations between indigenous contemporary and modern contemporary artists. She is a Norwegian, Australian, American turned Canadian global nomad, descended from fishermen and farmers, academics, homemakers, scientists, and engineers, and the core of her passion lies in bridging gaps, magnifying voices, and translating visual cultures. It's also very important to note that in the mid-1990s, Astri actually met Murni during a research trip to Indonesia and eventually became one of the first English language scholars to write about her art, if I'm not mistaken, for the Jakarta Post and several research papers as well. And so Astri, it's so wonderful to have you join us today.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you. It's been really fun to be working with the Gajah Gallery on this project and on the catalog.
For the past like 6-7 months already, if I'm not mistaken, the start of the year. So if we can just dive right in the conversation, because I'm sure like there's so much you'd like to say, Astri. And if I'm not mistaken, we can just dive right in.
So I'm going to share screen.
Yes, you can share screen.
And I don't have images. I don't have images for all of the points, but
that's okay.
And I hope that everyone, if you haven't had a chance to read the catalog that's posted on the Gajah Gallery site yet, that you will, because this talk isn't really repetitive of the catalog essay that I wrote. And so it'll be supplementary to that. So feel free to read it if you didn't already, and things will really be filled out, I think.
Yeah, like what Ashley said, it's in our website at gajahgallery.com. So great. Astri, I'm curious to know, because you bring a very important perspective in the sense that you knew Murni personally. You met her, you knew her personally, you were her friend. And you had these impressions of her that I think also bring an important perspective in your interpretation of her art and her practice. So I read in your essay, you mentioned that she was not afraid to look and be different. She had chosen not to fit into normal or proper society. And crucially, that she didn't allow her brokenness to define her. And this shows in her art. So could you share a bit more about how you arrived at these observations? And, did you encounter when you met her any misconceptions about her art, or perhaps something surprising that you discovered about her when you met her in the 90s?
Well, let me share my screen as I'll get a picture of her coming up. And
That would be great.
yes, let's see. Play from start now. Does everybody have that? Can everybody see that?
Yes,
Good.
I can see it.
I assume so. Good. So yeah, this is a picture I took the first time I met Murni, and I have to say, I felt close to her, and we had a really sort of electric connection. But I think that I didn't meet her many times. I must have met her maybe 4 or 5 times. And I met her because of Mary Northmore at the Seniwati Gallery. So quite early on after the establishment of the gallery, I met Mary Northmore and was very excited because this was one of the first venues for women artists in Indonesia or Asia. Actually, I think it was the first gallery for women artists in Asia. And Mary Northmore and the crew that she had around her were a very dynamic crew. And several other women had been involved with the inception of the gallery. And eventually I had an MA student who went to do her MA thesis on the gallery. So sitting in London in a cafe while I was at a conference with my 6-month-old baby with me, that I had a grad student, fortunately I had a grad student at the University of London who could hold her while I talked, gave my paper. She did wail, of course. She had to. But then at the cafe afterwards with Mary, she said, Astri, I have met this amazing artist and we're featuring her at the gallery and I have to show you pictures. And so back in those days, it's not cell phones with photos, right? It's little printouts that you had taken with a film camera and gone and had developed, etc.
I was born already.
Yeah, do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Well, I think it's nice to have that memory. And of course, my students who are like 18 to 22, they don't. So I saw this work, which was unlike anything I'd seen before. And I think that in a way sets the tone for how it was to meet Murni as well. She was unlike most Indonesians or Balinese that I had met before, and definitely unlike, I think, unlike the women, except perhaps my research assistant, Tis Alvalinga, who's from Cirebon, and who came to stay with me and work with me in Yogyakarta, who was also very outgoing and unafraid and dressed like a boy basically, and so broke those gender codes. So Murni and I know a number of other women were doing that of her generation, but I hadn't met one of the artists like this before, because I'd interviewed, I think I was the first researcher who focused on women artists as part of my dissertation, which was finished in 1991 and then became part of my 1994 book, Soul, Spirit, and Mountain, Preoccupations of Indonesian Contemporary Artists. But I hadn't met Murni then. So all of the women artists that I interviewed for that were very free spirits, in most of them, very refined presentation as women in society. And even the wildest of them, which was Kartika Afandi, she could go back and forth between being very refined and very Javanese and then completely out there. But Murni didn't bother with any of that. She just, when I met her, it was 9 years after I began my Indonesian research. And I was used to connecting quickly with people because I've been a traveler all my life, and you don't know when you're on the metaphorical Silk Road, you don't know how long you have to be with someone. So when you feel a resonance,
Yeah.
you kind of explore it, right?
Yeah.
And you treasure the
spark.
connection, the
Yeah.
spark. Yeah. But I had met so many very gracious Indonesian artists, and even the most famous within Indonesia. And I often thought, oh my God, if I were doing this research in America or Europe, I couldn't just walk up to the studio of David Hockney and knock and say, I'd like to interview you, or Robert Motherwell, or any of the greats, right? I mean, can you imagine trying to approach Van Gogh in a field of sunflowers? No.
No.
Indonesian artists and people have this cultural, social grace, which is an art form in and of itself. And I'm sure it didn't hurt that I was, like, for most of them, the first foreigner that they had ever talked to who was interested in their art. And I was going, against advice from my professors and professionals back home to research a topic that supposedly back in America, didn't exist. But
Okay.
yeah, but it was an amazing experience. And so when I met Murni, this photo, I think, shows that she was like a dam that had sprung a leak. There was no stopping her. And she had no time for small talk. So she didn't ask me any of the usual questions like, dari mana, mau kemana, where are you from?
Okay.
And do you know how to eat rice? That was a question we...
Wow. So what did she ask you? Like, what are the kinds of things she would...
Not too much. After I identified myself as, I was interested in her art. And I'm sure Mary had also told her that I would be coming, and a little bit about who I was. So it was more like we just kind of focused on her work and her life and what she was painting and what she was thinking. And she does mention in, I think you quote her in your essay, your wonderful essay in the catalog, that she drank a lot of coffee all night when she stayed up painting. And so I think her personality was naturally caffeinated.
Interesting.
And so she wanted to tell me about her biography and her mind journeys. She wasn't yet speaking about the abuse. And she was like a rice granary on fire. Okay. But it was clear to me that it was all this dramatically expressed emotion, but it wasn't, it was a life-giving fire, not a destructive fire. Okay. So really not a rice granary on fire. That was the wrong metaphor. But the fire, I also had just been writing about how this procreative fire can be associated with the sexual expression of the life force. And it's celebrated in so many older indigenous cultures, fertility and what brings fertility about, even blood sacrifice, right? Yeah. In order to bring fertility about. And in the more or less esoteric schools of yoga or martial art, and the most extreme or esoteric of the yogic or philosophical schools, tantra or tantric thinking. And I'm sure we'll talk more about sexuality later, but I also I was so excited when I found the reference to Kendedes, the I think 13th or 14th century East Javanese queen, who is celebrated in the beautiful sculpture called Prajna Paramita, that's in the National Museum in Jakarta. And she was considered such a powerful woman, both in terms of stature and as a queen and as the Shakti fire that enabled her husband to become the king. And she was described as someone who had a flaming womb. Womb.
Oh, okay.
Yes, WOMB.
Wow. Okay.
And so all of this, from various eras and various cultures, I think informed my perception of Murni. And of course, more and more as I saw her work as it developed in the so I met her in mid 1996, and as it developed into the early 2000s and became more and more graphic and dramatic in some ways.
Yeah. And that's kind of the first impression you get when you see Murni's work, which is something that kind of leads me to my next question, which you talk about. You
Can I
raised.
say one? Can
Oh
I
yeah.
say one more thing about her first impression?
Yeah.
It's so unusual in sort of general society in
Mhm.
Indonesia, both Java and Bali, which are the places I know best. That a friend of mine who's lived in Indonesia, he's a foreigner and he's lived in Indonesia for 40 years. And
Okay.
when I sent him the link to the Chameti interview with her, and
Okay.
he studied her body language and could also, hear what she was saying, even though the sound quality isn't so great. And he went, whoa, I think this is one angry woman. And I
Wow.
thought
That's an
that,
interesting.
yeah.
Okay.
And I didn't totally agree
Mm-hmm.
because I don't think she was an angry woman, but
Mm-hmm.
she was angry at times about
Okay.
very valid and just
Very valid.
things.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think she showed all of her emotions. And I think that that's something that future research can also take into account, that there's
Mm.
a whole range of emotions that are expressed very openly. But yes, anger, one of them.
Wow, that's an interesting that's an interesting observation.
Yeah.
Yeah, because when I read about her, I always see that the vibrant, the lively personality and the anger, which is very valid. It's an interesting thing to think about also when looking at her art. And yeah, so thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And
Thanks.
I'm so interested to you kind of delved into that in earlier, but I'm interested to know like what kind of were your motivations? Because in your recent essay, you talk about further explorations and you want to talk about some of the things that weren't as explored then, which were her more like overtly sexual themes. You want to explore, you get into more of like how this expanded consciousness that's present in her work connects to the ancient traditions which you mentioned earlier, as well as of indigenous peoples across the world, across history, and neo-shamanistic ideas. Why do you think one that wasn't as these themes didn't receive as much public discussion, and what motivated you to explore further and deeper into this?
Yeah. Excuse me. Well, when I first wrote about women artists in the Indonesian modern contemporary art scene, based on research in the late 80s, at the time there weren't any Indonesian art historians exploring those themes, very much at least. Some journalists were beginning to look into it, but now, and since the early 2000s, there's been several excellent publications by Indonesian feminist art historians. So I don't need to go and look at those themes anymore, so to speak, because
Mhm.
the themes of gender equality and a woman looking to emancipate her view of herself and own her own body and reclaim her
Women.
sexuality and all of that, that's being dealt with very well by very well trained and very
Yeah,
bright.
very important.
Yes,
Art.
very important, so important. And so, but it kind of made me think, well, what else is going on there? And then the fact that Gajah Gallery, as well as other internet sources, had a whole bunch of art that I hadn't seen by Murni
Mhm.
as one collection. So
Okay.
we'll talk later about a possible future database, but the beginning of that is there on the internet and with the Gajah Gallery, which has a recent commitment to research as well as being a commercial gallery.
Yeah.
So education and research in addition as newer themes, right?
Yes.
So you offered a lot of research material as a package there, and I found more, and that allowed me to see more of her oeuvre, her life work,
Yeah.
which is what an art historian loves to do, right? It's not like we sit around and wait for the artist to die so we can see
Yeah.
what work they're coming up with. I wish to God Murni had lived another 20 or 30 years. But once an artist is gone, you can see, what was the whole. And thirdly, in the last 10 or 15 years or so since I had written about her, there's been a resurgence of a new kind of research into not just the anthropology of shamanism, where academics are writing about a culture, but the actual teachings and practices of shamanism, where academics and other people are apprenticing themselves. But as more than participant observation as a technique, they're apprenticing themselves to actually really understand as much as they can of the culture of shamans and their work from the inside. So they train as shamans.
Wow.
And that to me
So
was fascinating, because it takes the whole idea of experiential pedagogy, which we talk about in the university in the last 10 years. And it takes the idea of not going in and becoming the authority on another culture, right? So it kind of takes a step towards decolonizing and towards putting people on equal footing. So this is a whole area of scholarship that I'll have a few images of later. But that also, it stimulated some of those ideas. And also the fact that I have personally also been training a little bit in order to understand it better. So indigenous studies is a recently emerging area on a global scale, and that's very exciting. And so the attention to shamanism is part of that. And then you get the popular culture version of it, right? Because the more you have an internet, the more you have people talking across disciplines, across demographies, across cultures, then someone's going to see, oh, we can make money here, right? Yeah. So we're going to have online shamanic courses, or, your neighbor sets up a shingle, and artwork begins to happen of different kinds and has happened before, and so on. So we're going to play a little bit with that too, a little bit later.
Which is, we can kind of delve into a bit of, let's go to like her context in Bali, which is something that you touch on, which is like, you touch on the spiritual dimensions that surrounded her. We know that, like, from our research, we know that she didn't really identify herself as a religious person, but it's important that you discuss like her surroundings and kind of like, for instance, the psycho-spiritual dramas in Balinese culture. And you also talk about the prevalent linga yoni, which still serve as the main objects of worship in some temples. And you kind of see how some of these beliefs and these motifs bled, whether subtly or explicitly, into her art, despite the fact that she didn't identify much as a religious person. So related to your discussion on, your growing interest in this, can you elaborate a bit more on these spiritual layers in Murni's work, and kind of like the complexities these bring to her work, and your readings of her work, and maybe the tensions it brings as well? Sure,
that's a very big question, and
sorry, you don't have to.
No, it's a very, very good question. For everybody's information, Nicole and I had gone through a few questions beforehand, and now my notes are all scrambled up. So I'll probably be more scrambled than usual, but I think I have some images. So looking at the Balinese context and stepping back for a second, it's really important for me that everyone understands that I'm not trying to classify Murni as a Balinese artist. She is Balinese. She is woman. She is, of her generation, and she is many, many things. So these labels that we have to use if we're using language, none of them are conclusive, are meant to be conclusive or fully descriptive. But artists are porous beings. Babies are porous beings, right? They soak up everything. And kind of tongue-in-cheek, I argue that artists are those babies who didn't stop soaking up everything.
Yeah.
And so they soak up their context. And Murni, who traveled a little bit to Hong Kong, to Melbourne, to Thailand, she didn't travel nearly as much as she would have wanted to, but she also had access to friendships with foreigners and her partner. And I think
Mondo.
also to books. Yeah, so Mondo or Eduardo Sanolini. That would be another further question to look into, like what books did she have access to, or calendars, or slideshows, or I know she was really moved by the Frida Kahlo film that she got to see at the Senewati Gallery. So she developed her own cosmopolitanness. Meanwhile, though, starting her life in Bali and then going to Ujung Pandang, then she already had another culture there, largely Muslim, possibly also some Toraja, I'm not sure. And then working from the age of 10. You outlined so well her background in your essay, the first essay in the catalog. So read it, people. And then she ended up in Jakarta with a Chinese family. So already here we have that wonderful hodgepodge of different cultures that Southeast Asia is quite well known for. And that also the tolerance for cultural diversity. Even if you might not want your kid to marry someone from there, there's a tolerance in general, which of course the last couple of decades has seen beginning to unravel, sadly. But she grew up while that tolerance was still there. And she was also running away from some of her personal pain, right? But she went back to Bali. So when she was, I forget now the timeline, if she was about
early 20s. I think
20,
it was early 20s. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, good. You're the expert on the timeline there. And so there she came to an area that's, let's see if I can, wait. Oh, this isn't fitting the screen properly. That's too bad. Well, maybe we can do this slightly differently, because I would hate to miss some of that. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment. And wait, did I stop sharing? Can you see my
Yes, I can
screen?
see your screen, yes.
You can see the PowerPoint?
No more. I can't see the PowerPoint.
Okay, so we're going to see, unfortunately, we're going to look at a slightly imperfect version of the PowerPoint. Where,
It's
actually,
okay.
I hate to say it, this is actually very funny, but one of the images had decided to take matters into its own hand and actually move off the screen. That's really funny. Okay, we're going to start sharing again.
So we were kind of like in the part where she went back to Bali in her early 20s. Oh, yeah, there it looks.
Yes. So again, this is going to be a little bit of a hodgepodge. I'd want to just mention how I think that her artwork grabs people because of its sensationalism, because you cannot make out what's going on right away, right? And so later I'm going to have a reference to that headless female figure that
with the grasshopper.
Apparently with the grasshopper that is apparently headless, or the head is being devoured, or the head is a flower, which is something that she often does as well, where she has composite figures of humans and plants. And then the references that she makes to me and my child as in the cat painting. So where it's clear that she is aware that she's painting aspects of herself in a humorous and funny way. And so if you pay attention to the eyes on those cats, we're going to see a direct reference to a craft that was made in Bali in the 90s, which she would have been surrounded by. So this grasshopper had left the screen. It's pretty funny. It had literally hopped off. And that's where, if you're in a shamanic mode of thinking, you're saying to yourself, you have agency, don't you? You funny little thing. Now, what's your message there?
It's all part of it.
Yeah, and I can see that in this format now, because, well, I wonder if maybe we can
Well,
actually
this is
view them now. Maybe it was just that image. Ah, I think we're back.
okay.
Okay, so this is just an example of Alberto Villoldo, who has a PhD and worked as an academic, and his partner and wife, Marcela Lobos, who created the Four Winds Society. And so they're people who are teaching shamanism online.
Okay.
But I feel like they're doing a very good job of it. And anyone who's interested can look into him or the Four Winds Society for his background. But he's an example of where, you know, the academic institution is just one of many knowledge cultures. And any knowledge culture can turn out to be a little bit defensive about, we have the correct knowledge, right? Whether it's a religious culture or an academic culture or anything, right? A ritual culture, a gender-based, sexuality-based culture. And so he was heavily criticized, as were other academics like in the same situation, who had started to speak from within the way of thinking that the shamans did in their research. They were told, this, you can't do this in your dissertation because you're speaking as a believer. You have to speak as the disinterested outsider.
Okay.
Outside authority, right?
Yeah.
So there's this, this is beginning to change in the academic world now, and the experiential dimension of learning is beginning to come in, which I think is very important and very rich.
Yeah.
And so you get these alliances between academics or professionals or neo-shamans and their teachers, wherever they are, in the Andes or in Borneo or in Ecuador or in the Sami people in Norway, wherever, right? So we're living in a world where this these interconnections are possible. And you see that in Murni's life and work too, that she was a world unto herself. It's not like she really needed the outside world. She had so much going on in her, but she was also very friendly and outgoing and connected with people. Yeah. Probably partly also because she spent so many hours alone with her work, but she was very, very
and
open.
she easily connected to people of different cultures and different backgrounds as well.
Yes. So there's a universal side to her that was quite at ease. And this also matches the idea that, yes, she is an artist from Bali and from Indonesia and from Southeast Asia. And she needs to be inserted and included in all of those layers of art history. But she also is such a universal person, and her themes are so burningly relevant at whatever level you read them, whether you read them as therapy and healing from having been abused or having been excluded or having been, you know, discriminated based on whatever, you know, sexuality, race, gender, religion, whatever. There's such a lot of that there that can be, she could become the poster child for so much of that. And that's just, poster child means sort of a more commercial level of things, but people can rally around it. So in a very real sense, it's activist art.
No. Oh, wow.
I think, yes, and others have said that too. I think Wulan has argued that somewhere as well, in a slightly different way, but
and your term of activism is broad in the sense, and how do you define activist art by?
Well, in the sense that it addresses very real issues in the world. It's not just focusing around, you know, the artist's own navel or own, you know, peculiar interests. In a solitary sense, it reaches out to build bridges. And there is a layer of compassion and solidarity usually in activist art, because people take risks beyond their own self as well to improve a particular situation. For humanity as a whole, often, even though it can also start very locally. So for example, the anti-Suharto activist art was very specifically geared to Suharto's transgressions,
Mhm.
but it was on the basis of human rights and equality for all, and safety from being, from not being killed in your home, or for the freedom to speak, etc., which are universal things. Yeah. So yeah, back to the sensational though. So it's pretty sensational when someone says, this is my symbol, this is me, this is a self-portrait, I think. And I write about this in my essay, and there's some other references in the catalog too. And here she's chosen this delightful variation on a Chinese dragon. And
Yes.
I also have a reference later to dragons she would have seen in Bali. But this is clearly more of a Chinese inspired one. So again, where did she ever go to the Chinese temple in Denpasar, for example? I would love to know that. But it's a very powerful self-image.
Yes.
Right? She's floating in what could be air, it could be water, and the Chinese dragon is a creature of both. And she's also got a book there for her head.
For her head.
Yeah, which signals that she may have been indeed looking at a lot of books. And I think I saw that Mary Northmore is present here, and maybe she can contribute about, I think Saniwati had quite a good library too, and people donated to it. And so Saniwati was one of those loopholes from where you could glimpse so much else of the world.
Source.
Yeah. So sensation, people are grabbed by, the physical and sexual imagery. And again, I think living in Bali, you experience this very different and very intense sensation as part of the aesthetics. So you see everything on the left side of the screen is the way Balinese dancers use their eyes, and comparing that to everything on the right side of the screen, how Javanese dancers use their eyes. So not to make a big, huge generalization here, but just as, one example of the kind of difference that you get in dance, and also in mask making. But there I would like to take it one step further, where on the left you have this wonderful Balinese mask with the eyes wide open in a slightly different way than these young women had their eyes open. And on the right, the Javanese or Lombok mask, it was identified as both where I found it, so I'm not sure. And also the Buddha head from the Borobudur. All of these three expressions are about seeing beyond, and seeing beyond ordinary reality. And I'm going to, if we get to it, talk a bit about the term ordinary reality, because I think that's the term that is being used a lot in shamanic studies and neo-shamanic training now. But I think it's a term that's aimed at the Western audience, because we in the West have a certain definition of what reality is. And it's very different than what the definition in Bali is. So beyond ordinary reality is beyond what we Western people
are
think
trained
ordinary
to see.
reality. Yeah. Whereas in Bali, it could very well be that ordinary reality includes all those layers that we profess don't exist.
Consciousness.
Yeah.
Realms
of other worlds, etc., and connections between different dimensions and spirits and ancestors and gods and deities, lesser and larger, etc. But so the Buddha went about connecting with a larger consciousness than this world in his way, and the Javanese mask dancers and the Balinese mask dancers show that the visionary quality, which I think is so important in Murni's work.
Yes.
Right? She's having visions of
her dreams. Yeah.
Yes. And are they just fantasies? Are they subconscious burps,
Yeah. And you identify them as visionary dreams.
I do. And that's in the framework that I'm talking from, which will be much more coherent if people read the essay, but just a little drip and drop here. And you asked, she wasn't religious. So was she spiritual or
Mm.
what? So here is this wonderful picture you have on, I think it's page 23 in your article.
Yes, in the article where I talk about how she kind of she was interested in dance, traditional dance, and she danced the baris, which
Yes,
was traditionally for boys.
yes, that's right. So there she just naturally bent that gender code and um, did it. And so this is Murni herself in full makeup. You can see that um, she's got her eyes open, maybe not as open as the dancers. She's not as trained. She admitted that she was a terrible dancer.
She wasn't afraid. What was
Not at all.
wonderful about her, she tried all these different creative art forms, not just painting, not just visual arts, but she
Yes. No. Yes. She tried silverwork and
wood
mask
carve,
carving,
yeah,
and
mask
she was a
making, wood
seamstress,
carving.
wood carving. She sewed clothing.
Yeah.
Um, she just had this appetite
Mm-hmm.
for creative expression and the material making. She loved materials of all kinds. Even as you and Wulan show that her last work was metal sculpture.
Yes.
Yeah, that is
Yes.
totally different from the rest of her oeuvre.
Yeah, but it's different, but it connects to her, to what she was working
Absolutely.
towards. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So whether she was spiritual and or religious, I had I'd written some thoughts about that. Mm, um, I I think that Bali is a place where art in all forms just thrives and also throbs. And there's a sense that when you listen to Balinese people talk, if they feel comfortable talking openly to you, they are describing a universe which and a world where the air itself is filled with energies um, that they could call spirits and often do. Um, and so I don't know if that recognition of consciousness and energies in everything around you is spiritual. Again, in the West, we might call that earth-based spirituality. We might call that an ecological
Mm.
spirituality, ecology-based spirituality. There, for example, in Java, that view is just called science. That's the scientific understanding of the world. So again,
Yeah, that's so
nomenclature
interesting.
is very tricky. And if you say spiritual in English, you may give a totally wrong impression. Um, but I believe that Murni had soaked in through her skin just that there's energy everywhere and that she was a dynamo, a big dynamo of energy as well. And so that she could commune with that energy. And that's what I think a lot of her works are about.
Mm-hmm.
And why I think a lot of her beings and creatures, strange creatures, are not easily recognizable. And so you get these strange encounters between creatures that are partly human and partly not. And
Mm-hmm.
what is that all about? Is it bestiality? Is it super kinky sex? Or
Mm-hmm.
is it a view that we're all somehow united, which is a bit of a cliche, right? But that A, we can all pleasure ourselves, and that B, the urge to merge with your surroundings, with no judgment, with no sense of it just can't be done, with no sense of typical normative morality. Um, it's just not important. Then this is kind of a tantric view as well. So
Mm-hmm.
celebrating the life force. And there's also elements of the humor that is almost like Zen too, right?
The
So
humor
that,
is so
yeah,
interesting.
And some friends of mine have seen this work and are really grossed out. And other friends of mine, from including a friend from Bali, we just guffaw, we just giggle.
And that's so interesting, the different reactions and responses as well from across time and across geographies.
Yes, and there's another, I do have a little blurb at the end about what I would like to see for future directions, but there's another one since it comes up here, that it would be fascinating to collect people's impressions of the work. And I suspect that there are some collectors here tonight, and I would urge any collectors here who may be taking home some of the work from the exhibition, that perhaps as you live with it and as your reactions kind of, you know, develop and morph, and as you have a new thought or idea, you know, take notes, send them to Nicole, send them to me.
To Astri. Yeah, and on that note, if anyone in the audience, since we're approaching almost our last 10 minutes, has any questions, I'd just like to remind you can submit your questions in the chat box over here. But Astri, since you were kind of delving into that, what are those, like, you talk about these intersectionalities a lot throughout this talk and even in your essay. What are those things you'd like to see in future research on Murni's work?
Yeah, well, let me go through a few more of the slides here since we're running out of time.
Yes,
And these intersectionalities are being sort of included drip by drip, but I have sort of one at the end. And so I just wanted to show people, this is a very typical art historical thing to do, especially since the 1972 publication of Michael Baxendall's book, Painting and Experience in 15th Century Italy, where he says, basically, he has a long study on how everyday life and everything an artist sees influences what comes out eventually as art. And so here I think you can see in these cat faces a very clear similarity to the painting Me and My Child, where Murni is the cat with the kitten on her back, right? And here with this dragon, you can also see, whereas the face is quite different from the dragon that she presents herself as, the face is actually very much like the expression. It's an extreme version of the expression on the dancers' faces. And it would be exactly like the expression on the demonic masks, like Rangda and her helpers. So a wonderful Balinese adaptation, even with a big nose. I don't know what that's, we all know what big noses usually refers to in Indonesian and Chinese art. Maybe this is to the tourists who are going to buy me, you know. And then whenever art historians look at comparisons, they also look at the contrasts and differences, right? And so you have the fabulous ornateness of Balinese art versus the increasingly simple work as Murni gets towards what is going to be the end of her life. She gets simpler and simpler. And she loses a lot of the patterning. So whereas in earlier works, she has these sort of backwards worlds and humor, where you have Ravana, the demon king of Lanka, stealing and kidnapping Sita on the left. And then this surreal and wonderful play of cigarette smoking pink snakes and high heel wearing critters. Not clear what. I first thought they were elephants, but I'm not sure.
I thought so too. Now that I'm looking at it, it doesn't seem.
Yeah. And again, we don't have words for it. These are fantasy creatures coming out of her dreams. What are her dreams? Something we won't really have time to talk about is that in the shamanic work, journeying through the mind to encounter, as we live in the middle world, to journey to the lower world to encounter power animals and spirit guides, or the upper world to encounter more ancestral and other kinds of guides. teachers more. Both that very catonic, earthbound, underground feeling of meeting your power animals that you then work with to understand how to bring medicine and healing back to the world, to including yourself, but also to the world. When you have that thought, then you start looking at her works. Here, for example, she is paying homage to her ancestor, the grandfather, which is one of her earlier works, which I don't think we have documented with you guys. And a friend of mine just sent pictures of this. Back to the theme of how Murni loved crafting and learning skills. She was a fabulous seamstress.
Mm-hmm.
And this probably 1997 work on the left has such an interesting series relationship to the one on the right from the next year, where you see that it's so dark and separated on the one on the left, and some kind of unification or coming together has happened in the image, and whether that reflects something that's come together in her as well, or just a different vision in a different dream. And then this headless female bodies, I could have probably shown a whole number of them. And we have one coming up actually. But in the fertility cults in India, there's this image. I don't know if she ever saw something like this. And there's much going on in Murni's painting that's not in the Gajah Gallery image, but 6th century, amazing images that barely get talked about in Indian art history. If you take a course in Indian art history, you most likely will not see an image like that. And then Murni has this play on the Linga Yoni, which was imported from India, but became very celebrated in Bali. And it may not be a headless female there, but it's not clear what her head is. And the title of it is 3 a.m. So she brings in the notion of time as well. Again, mind-boggling and humorous. Yeah. So here is just my note about non-ordinary reality and how that's a Western term. But a whole theme to look at is comparing Balinese views of the non-ordinary, or of the beyond human life, right? Of the spirit world, of the mythological world, of the demonic world. In my essay, I talk about the Bhima Swarga, the journey through hell, and all the different ways that very, very rich body of art plays with that, which again is there for Murni to go, to imbibe and come out with something completely different, completely her own with. But as for her floating, weightless, upside down bodies, the shamanic journey takes place in a world you could say is an upside down or backwards world, where all of the norms, first of all, time doesn't exist anymore, gravity doesn't exist anymore. And we know that there's a very deep tradition of trance in Bali, and this young lady is a trance dancer. Yeah. So I think there's a lot to explore by people who are Baliologists, who know Bali better than me, and or people who are open to linking new ideas. So patterns are everywhere around, and someone with very sharp eyes may see that this is the textile that I'm actually wearing. And it was made in Guianar. It's one of those BTBM, not hand, not machine made cloths woven with several different colored warp and weft threads. And it's the chili figure, the rice goddess figure. You can see they're all linking hands and linking feet. And some are upside down. Every other line is upside down, or maybe not. No, that's wrong. But the point being that it's the web of energies that is all around us. And so, of course, many people, younger people, think that the World Wide Web is a new idea, but it's an ancient Hindu and Buddhist and indigenous idea. And so, again, for her to be encountering this plethora of life forms in her dreams, or her vision journeys is natural. And so this filled universe that's filled with overlaps and patterns and regularity that's never a direct copy. Everything's a distinct individual little mark. And then you add to that, one of the problems I have with textile museums, which I love textiles, but they always show the textiles flat, and textiles are meant to be anything other than flat, right? Yeah. They're in motion. And Murni, in a totally different manner, shows her in motion pictures here. And it's like a dance. It's the tango of life forms of so many kinds, coming out of each other, reaching for each other, drooling for each other, wanting to penetrate, wanting to connect, like that moon.
Yeah, so, I love what you talk about when you talk about that movement and the motion in her figures.
Yeah, well, it's there, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so she didn't become a good dancer, but she totally, had to do it, and she had it on another level. So I think just a couple of last ones I wanted to show that, yes, I'm not saying that she doesn't have also art that speaks to pain. And Wulan writes so well about that in the catalog essay and in other essays she's written.
As well.
Yeah. And so here, I think it is important to note, though, that this is one of the few, these two are among the few works that I think Murni ever did on commission. And so she was commissioned for an article in a magazine that was talking about female circumcision.
Yeah.
And so here you have an example of the headless females. And here's an example of a series, a much longer series that she did from 1909 onwards, as you see in the black and white photo here, and 1998 and 1999, that are more complex, because the paintbrush in the black and white one, that's her creativity that she's linking to her fertility, or to her orgasmic pleasure center. So, and then you have the same thing with the scythe between her legs, but it's the scythe that's going to harvest the grain that the community needs. So it's a very complex image that brings up notions of sacrifice and ritual, and possibly bloodletting, possibly not. It's the Balinese offer to their metal implements every several months, and they don't cut themselves when they're doing it. So I don't know. It's a mystery, but it's a mystery that has many more layers than just that she was a misogynist, or that she, liked kinky sex, or something. No, not a misogynist, a masochist, or that she liked kinky sex, all of which may be true as well. I'm just saying, here's something to look into more, because the symbolism is very rich.
Yeah.
So I thought that we would do a little bit of fun, and this is just a minute, but I did a little ritual with the pop culture neo-shamanic tool of the oracle card deck. And I, with incense and smudging and my little rattle. And to me, this is play. This is playing in the quantum field. It's a party game. I'm sure that many of you here play online games or cards or something like that. So tongue in cheek, the idea that the serious can have a very funny side. Not to get attached to it, but the card that came up when I asked for a message from Murni, or for Murni, was the eyes of the eagle rising above the fray. And given her emphasis on vision and visioning stuff that, the fray is like, the noise of regular society, right? Yeah. She rose above it. She really did. And so I love that. And then this deck is made by Alberto Villoldo, who I showed earlier, who I've been studying with a little bit. And there's, of course, a description, which we don't have time to look at, but it talks about being yourself, even though you may be criticized. And so
And that
that was a
was
big theme, right?
very Murni.
Yes.
That was
And
very,
the other deck I tried is created actually by a local woman to the west coast of Canada here. And the card that I pulled, sort of invoking Murni, was truth on the right in the wild
wow.
deck. And it also had a very good just invitation to stand in your genuine truth in an honest, ingenious, resourceful, and reliable and responsible way. You are the leading player, the remarkable and inspiring superhero of your life. And yes, Murni was the hero of her life, with very good support from her partner and from Mary Northmore and her close
Mary.
friend Niwayan.
Niwayan Soraniti, who's
Yes,
joining us today, if I'm not mistaken, as well.
yes, it's so nice to see several old friends here and family, and yeah. So now it's the work for us is to place Murni and all women artists into an inclusive art history, not only at the national and regional levels, but I do believe that both of those are also important. There's been a lot of talk in the last decade or more, that 2 decades, that forget the national art histories. And I think that's a travesty, because now you see so much global art history being done by people who don't know any other parts of the world. And so it becomes tokenism and insertions without actually opening the minds to the differences. Because, and why would we want, a cookie cutter modern art history? So all those levels in a both and a both and kind of model, where layers are explored. And also projecting Murni into moments in Indonesian art history. And this is a fairly random example, but I've always loved Nazar's art, and I was very lucky to meet him about 3 or 4 years before he died, when he had a solo exhibition at TIM in Jakarta. And many of Murni's works I could have chosen that would fit these kind of, mysterious, amorphous forms of his, although she's more representational than him, and is maybe more complex symbolically. I don't know, but it's just an example of how you wouldn't just put women artists in a separate chapter.
Yes.
You would put them in dialogue with everybody else. And projecting Murni into the context of global art history, whether, local moments, and global art history is all local moments. It's just that we're going to be tying them together somehow, right? And so people may know the Destruction of the Father image by Louise Bourgeois, which of course, again, relates so directly to Murni's biographical experience, right? And a couple of people here will know this local artist who just passed away, but she's not known outside of Victoria very, very much. And that's Jeanette Miraglia-Steen, with her image of the cosmos called Opaline, which I love for how, formally speaking, it contrasted colors, but the forms really do seem to relate to this image from the subconscious of Louise Bourgeois. And so these women are all working with visions and visionary skill sets that can be spoken of together, even in their differences.
Wow.
So the end of delving into pop culture, shamanism, and global art history is that I want to end just with the idea of monumental Murni, where she creates these amazing works that are so resolved as monumental works. And a friend of mine said, oh my God, you got to get the gallery to make posters and t-shirts and cards of these amazing works.
I'll tell the gallery that. They're listening in right now, so.
Yeah, no, and I mean, copyright issues probably are a part of it, but she could be known everywhere. Yeah. I personally, love her work, and I know a lot of people do, and we loved our encounters, whether they were many or few, with Murni. And it's been a great pleasure to work with the gallery now as well. And the last thing I wanted to mention before we open up for questions is that I think that we've mentioned several things in terms of future work, but ultimately, I would love to see her dream of a foundation come to fruition as an online site. And so this would mean, that the collectors who collect her work would share what work they have with a central database, galleries, art auctions, when works change hands, if there was some way to track it, if there was some way we could plug into the idealism of both, owning gorgeous work in your home and knowing that it's also part of the public treasure. And I thank collectors, because you save a lot of work from destruction by collecting it and keeping it in your homes. And if you're here, it means that you care about the knowledge about it too, as well as the investment, as most collectors do. So the internet is a place where, in addition to piracy and theft and bullying and all kinds of displays of ignorance happens, there's also these connections of surprising kinds that we can experience, and how knowledge can be disseminated further than and easier than ever before in our history. And then just today, I saw that 9 people in Boston, Massachusetts, has signed on to my academia.edu account. And they've all read my article on Afandi, which means there's a summer course somewhere that's teaching about modern Indonesian art in the context of perhaps global art or Asian art or something like that. And that is new in terms of the history of curriculum.
Amazing.
University of Victoria hired me. I started exactly 30 years ago this year.
Wow.
So you have your 25th anniversary, I have my 30th. And it was a totally pioneering move that they said, yes, bring on the modern Indonesian, Southeast Asian, Asian curriculum as a regular part of our teaching. But we're also a small university. We haven't necessarily had a huge impact, but it is happening more and more, and the big museums are now, hiring. For the last 10, 15 years, I've been hiring curators for modern and contemporary Asian art. So the internet can be a really wonderful place that augments the institutions, as long as we know how to navigate it safely. And so let's see if we can start building a bigger database, because Murni's oeuvre still has lots of mysteries to divulge. Yeah.
Why it's so exciting to talk about her work and to talk to you today to help us as well in these interpretations, which are so wonderful and so enlightening.
You're so sweet, and it's been wonderful to work with you and Aisha and to work alongside Wulan. So yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we don't have some questions, but we do have a comment that she loved the painting with the skate, and fascinating to think about the connections between the harvest and women's fertility. So thank you for sending that over. And thank you as well to everyone who joined us today. And
hey, can I ask people to type into the chat where they're from?
Oh yeah, can you please?
I would love to just see the geography that we're reaching here. Maybe where they're from and where they are at, if that's a different place right now.
Australian living in Singapore.
Cool.
All over, living in New York.
Yeah. Nice. Redding, California. Hi, Ellen. Pauline from Singapore. This is great.
Usha. Paul from Singapore.
Hi, Paul.
Oh, wow. We have so many. Jakarta, Victoria, where you are.
Hi, Nikki. Hi, Anne.
Wulan, Melbourne.
Hi, Wulan. Can't wait for your talk, Wulan.
I'm in Manila, for people who don't know.
Yes, yes. And Malaysia, that's great.
India.
Narm. Oh yeah. Wulan and Narm. Indiana, Ithaca. Yes. Oh, Astara. Hi. This is great. I wish I could see all your faces. We'll just have to do friendship Zooms soon. Thank you all for coming. This is just
Thank you so much for coming. And thank you so much, Astri, for being so generous with your time, not just today, but all these months, and really putting your heart and soul into the research on Murni and into her, and into your passion as well into this. And I just want to briefly announce what you mentioned earlier. Our next online conversation will be next week with art historian Dr. Wulan Dirgantara, who's also with us today. And she'll be discussing Murni's place in Balinese and Indonesian art history. So, and our live exhibit, our physical exhibit, is still ongoing in Singapore, even amidst a phase 2. I think it's phase 2 now in Singapore. So if you're in Singapore, please do visit the exhibit. And if you're not, you can check out our website at gajahgallery.com and our social media pages on Instagram and Facebook for all our further announcements, and our emails as well, for our online and offline talks and events and panel discussions as well. So thank you so much, everyone, again, and thank you, Astri. This was really great.
And thank you, Murni.
Thank you, Murni.
Yes. Take care. This was great. I wish I could go to Singapore in person.
One day we will be together
as soon as I can. But thank God for this technology, hey?
Yeah.
Yeah. And now have fun playing with shamanic journeys.
Thank you for that, Astri.
Bye.
Bye.
We'll talk soon.
Again.